recording. So we are recording this morning, and thank you for joining me for YIC webinar session 34. Let me get your faces over where I can see you as we get started. All right. So here is our agenda for today's session. As usual, I'll do our welcome, mindfulness moment, and introduction of presenters. And I'm Amanda Charlesworth, the YIC program specialist at the State Board of Ed. After my introductions, we will have Bethany Marker and Michelle Glaittli, who are the two school counselors specialists here at the State Board of Education, present how to collaborate with school counselors to support student success. After Bethany and Michelle, we will hear from Dr. Meghan Semenick, and Dr. Meghan will be presenting Neuropsychology of Developmental Trauma. I have to admit, I'm very excited for today's webinar. Both topics are very much of interest to me. I love collaboration and I love brain science. All right, so this morning, for a quick mindfulness moment, I found some mindfulness activities that could be done as part of a car road trip or just given out to our students as part of summer activities to help them practice and keep those skills up over the summer. I particularly like the mindfulness bingo because it touches on things that are outside of yourself as well as internal. So like make someone laugh or compliment someone, as well as like finding something smooth or something soft and maybe the grass under your feet. And as we all know, I think we need to get outside more. So I particularly liked that one. And then the car color search game, I'm sure everybody knows that one. But if your family is particularly competitive like mine, having a score tracker is very beneficial. And then, of course, I always love a breathing activity. I was thinking if you're in a road trip and you're the passenger, breathing activity might be especially helpful if you run into traffic or you end up behind on your schedule and you're feeling that stress of the road trip. All right, so that is our quick mindfulness moment. And as always, in the chat, if you all have something exciting to share out as the school year is winding down, please do. As we go through, we'll read out some of those fun items if you have any. And now let's move on to introduction of our presenters. So first I have Michelle Glaittli. Dr. Michelle Glaittli is what I've learned recently. She is a school counselor specialist at the State Board of Education in the Student Services Department. And Michelle graduated from University of Utah School Counseling Master's Program and earned her Doctor of Education in Leadership and Innovation from Arizona State University. Prior to her work at USBE, Michelle was the president of the Utah School Counselor Association in 2019 and 2020. And she spent 8 years as a professional school counselor. Outside of work, she enjoys college football, attempting home repairs, and time with her family. Michelle, I especially appreciate the attempting home repairs. I'm in that boat too. With Michelle, we will have Bethany Marker, and she is the other school counseling specialist at the State Board of Ed and Student Services. Bethany graduated from the University of Phoenix in educational counseling and has been a professional school counselor for 20 years. She received a degree in, she also received a degree in social work from BYU. Prior to her work at USBE, Bethany worked as a lead counselor in Nebo School District in both secondary and elementary schools. Outside of her work, Bethany loves hiking with her family, traveling, reading, anything involving music, eating out, watching her son play high school basketball, and playing with her puppy. Bethany, it definitely sounds like you have a good work-life balance. After Bethany, we will hear from Dr. Meghan Semenick. Dr. Semenick moved to Utah from Kentucky about 2 years ago, where she completed her doctorate in clinical psychology at Eastern Kentucky University. There, she dedicated her focus to working with children, adolescents, and adults in both inpatient and outpatient settings, with an emphasis on addressing and treating trauma, thought disorders, and personality diagnoses. She completed her residency in forensic psychology at the Utah State Hospital with a secondary focus on neuropsychology. Dr. Semenick was hired at the hospital following her fellowship and now primarily works with the court conducting forensic evaluations. I am excited to hear from all our presenters this morning. As always, here's a quick snap of the post-training survey link, and I send that out with our follow-up email. And additionally, if you have any questions about the webinar, you're welcome to reach out to the YIC staff. All right, with that, I am going to go ahead and stop my screen share and let Bethany and Michelle take it away.
Thank you, Amanda, for that introduction and for those fun mindfulness activities. My family, my husband's from Virginia, and so we have driven across country numerous times. We're both in education, and so we both had summers off, and so often we would go back for 4 to 6 weeks, and so it's fun to have some of those car trip activities. I love that kind of stuff, so thanks for sharing that. As Amanda mentioned, I'm Bethany Marker, one of the school counseling specialists, along with Michelle Glaittli, and we're here to talk to you about how to collaborate with school counselors to support student success. Please feel free throughout this presentation to chime in with great practices that you're doing or questions that you might have in working with your school counselor. We definitely partnership and collaborate together to do the best we can to support all of our students here in Utah. So the next slide introduces Michelle and I, which Amanda already did. So we'll go ahead and head on to the next slide. We wanted to talk about the Utah College and Career Readiness School Counseling Program model and just talk to you a little bit about the standards of what school counselors are required to do, what we're expected to do, kind of best practices, and then talk about that collaboration between mentors, trackers, check and connect, and school counseling piece. And so a little bit of history of the Utah school counseling model. We are in edition 3. The school counseling model comes up for review every 5 years. So it will be up for review 4th edition starting next year. It has gone through some different changes. It used to be the Utah Comprehensive Guidance and School Counseling Model. In 2019, it changed to the College and Career Readiness School Counseling Model. And as we've had changes, we've also seen an increase in school counselors throughout the state. I first started in the early 2000s. We didn't have very many school counselors. I remember when they were pushing to get 75 school counselors across the state, and it was a big deal. We currently have over 1,400 school counselors, and we are a K through 12 school counseling program. We do support elementary school counselors as well as secondary school counselors in the K through 12 model and framework, but funding is currently only available for secondary. So funding comes through our CTE partnership. It's a CTE add-on, and that comes just for 7th through 12th grades. So that's interesting to know. There are a lot of school districts and charters who do have elementary school counselors, but they aren't currently funded in any way through like legislation or through USBE. That's just up to school boards, LEAs, and charters if they decide to have elementary counselors in their program. So right now, the Utah College and Career Readiness Program model, I'll just read through this. Traditionally, school counseling has been thought of as a function of secondary. However, school counseling recognizes the importance of early intervention in elementary school. This framework is intended to support the design and implementation of systemic counseling programs for all grade levels. So like I said, we'll go through and just talk about right now we have 7 standards. We also have mindsets and competencies that we'll talk a little bit about as well. And we'll go ahead and start with standard 1.
Yeah, so as Bethany mentioned, I think it's really important as we are collaborating with different individuals, the more that we can speak each other's language, the more we're going to be able to connect and move forward in our work a lot more quickly. So our first standard is really knowing all of our students, to be aware of like our percentages of different groups that we want to keep track of. So whether students are advancing academically or if they're struggling academically, if they have an IEP or 504, if they are a YIC student. So really making sure that counselors are aware of who's in the building and that each of those different groups are getting the support for equitable outcomes. So that would be something like a Check and Connect mentor or other different mentoring setups, so that those students that might have some risk factors are able to have that extra support. So this really is a standard that helps school counselors to know what's needed in their school, what areas that they need to kind of fill gaps in. So it really directs the rest of the program and the work school counselors do to kind of know basically what's going on in the school, who the students are, and what their needs are. That leads directly into our standard 2, which is all about data. So school counseling programs are data driven. We love data. We must have data. So as you're working with school counselors, this is a great opportunity for collaboration. We require that counseling teams submit a data project to us at USBE each year. We have a template for it, a lot of different requirements that school counselors have to complete, but this would be a great place for some collaboration to work smarter and not harder, to really have those conversations about, we see this gap and this might be a great data project, and then to have that collaboration between you as mentors and the school counselors, because we do have a systemic intervention kind of going through what are we doing individually, what are we doing in small groups, what are we doing in the community, right? All those different levels of interventions. And this would be a great place kind of at that individual level to have that collaboration, to say our mentors are doing this many meetings a week with this student group to really support those data projects. So I would say if you're talking to school counselors and you really want to have a strong collaboration, data projects would be a great place to start that conversation, since they would love to see the data that you're collecting and using, as well as being able to start that sharing of the data that counselors have back from that standard 1. So like I mentioned, data is super important in school counseling. We love to collect it. We really look at it as we monitor student progress. We'll talk about MTSS in a little bit, but really using that to see how effective we are in any of our interventions, but really also collaborating with you and seeing what data we have that you might need and vice versa, to really be focusing on measurable outcomes for students and making sure we have the correct students in the correct programs and the correct level of intervention.
So standard 3 is kind of a huge standard where we live as school counselors. And this is our plan for college and career readiness. Through legislative code and through USBE board rule, school counselors are mandated to complete a plan for college and career readiness. We call those CCRs or PCCRs for each student in grades 7 through 12. They do have to get an individual CCR plan. So those are generally where we invite parents to come. Here's the Utah code that Michelle's showing. This is generally where we invite parents to come and encourage them to come, where we set goals with students, where we talk about post-secondary plans with these students. They individually need to have one in the grades 7th and 8th, individually in grades 9th and 10th, and individually in grades 11 through 12, one of those 2 grades. So they will have 3 individual CCR plans. And then the other years they can choose to do, then we do the group plans. That's usually collaborated through the LEA or the charter to decide which grades will get individual, which grades will get the group plan. So this is a great place to also collaborate when you're working with your students on what their future goals are with the school counselor, maybe what they're working towards post-secondary. It might be an apprenticeship, it might be technical college, it might be a degree granting institution, it might be an internship. There are lots and lots of options that we talk about with our students and really guide that with the CCR process for what their plans and goals are after high school, post-secondary, as we talk about that. So the CCR plan is another place where we really can collaborate. If you have a student who has specific interests, they might have aptitudes in something as you're working with them. That's a great place to collaborate and talk about, hey, maybe these classes would be a great idea, or maybe this experience or this internship. So another place that we can collaborate. Standard 4 in our college and career readiness plan is career literacy. And this is where the counseling program provides career literacy assistance for each student to make informed decisions about choosing a career and next step planning to reach their goals. Some of you may be familiar with UScience or Keys to Success. We used to have Utah Futures, which was a big thing in Utah. They have lots of different interest inventories or aptitude tests or experiences, Reality Town. There's career fairs and different things that we support as school counselors that would also be really great for you to be aware of or supporting with your students as well, with that career literacy piece.
So Bethany mentioned we do have specific student mindsets and competencies that are basically like the counseling strands and standards that we pull from to do our collaborative classroom instruction, which is when we go into the classrooms. This is another great place to have that collaboration, again, to have that kind of common language and common vocabulary. So when school counselors come in and maybe they do a lesson on different coping skills, that you as mentors can be aware of those kind of different skills that they taught, so that as you're meeting with students, you can kind of refer back to that and say, hey, remember when the school counselor came in and taught you this? Or making sure that we're using kind of the same vocabulary as we talk about like different emotions and how we process and handle those things and what it means for life after high school, like Bethany was mentioning with post-secondary plans. So really another great place for collaboration to talk about, you know, what we're teaching in the classroom and how some of that can be used as you're meeting with students individually to kind of reinforce all of that was taught, but then also to refer back to it and kind of have that common language like I keep mentioning. So counselors will be in the classroom, and another great place for some collaboration. And standard 6. It's got a very long title, Systemic Approach to Dropout Prevention with Social Emotional Supports. This is kind of our responsive services area. And this is a huge, huge place for collaboration. This is where we look at a lot of different data, and we really want to make sure that any students are getting the services that they need, that we keep them in school, we keep them engaged, and they have both the academic and non-academic skills to be successful in school. So this is where MTSS comes into our framework. Hopefully your schools are collaborating with you on their MTSS, SST, CIT, a lot of different names for this team, but basically the multidisciplinary team that's meeting together with administrators, counselors, teachers, other support professionals in the building to really go through and see what are the needs of the students and to create that tiered approach. So making sure that that tier 1 for all students, that is where school counselors live. We love tier 1, making sure that all students have access to this information and this support. And then that tier 2 that need a little bit more than that. And then that tier 3 is really intensive. So counselors really aren't in that tier 3 very often. We're usually going to be referring to maybe like a school social worker or community resources, but definitely that tier 2 and tier 1 and 2 is where counselors spend a lot of their time. And this would be another great place for you to collaborate with school counselors and the whole MTSS team to talk about what supports are needed in the school, both school-wide and for kind of individual student groups and for individual students. So lots of things are covered in this meeting, both academic and non-academic, like I mentioned. So looking at attendance and grades, behavior. So this would be things like office referrals, discipline, different things like that. And this is really two-sided, that we really want to work on prevention. So we really want that tier 1 to be strong to prevent some of these things from happening. So really building student skills at the start, but then also for those students that need additional support, that we're intervening as early as possible after that, so that they can kind of stay on track and stay on grade level with all of those different things. So really a great place for collaboration, both as mentors and school counselors, but then as the whole team at the school in this framework. And then our last standard 7 is alignment. So this is really, again, like Bethany mentioned at the beginning, talking about how school counseling is K-12 and really making sure that as a student moves through from the elementary to the high school, that there's kind of some consistency and some support through those transitions. We know that the transitions between elementary and junior high, and then again, junior high to high school, are some of the most difficult times for students, especially that first transition from having an elementary teacher, one teacher all day, and then you move to the junior high or middle school, and now you're having, 7 or 8 teachers and lockers. Oh my goodness, right? So a lot is going on during that transition. So part of this standard is that the school counselors are working with those in their kind of cone, cluster, feeder system, whatever term your area uses, to make sure that they're giving those support services for students. So this is typically done, you know, kind of about this time of year in the spring, that the counselors will meet together and say, hey, here are the students that I'm working with on this skill. Here's students that need support in this academic area. Here's these students that I've been doing a small group about, you know, friendship skills, social skills, right? All of that kind of information so that those services remain and stay consistent for that student, even though they're changing schools. And so this would be another great place for mentors to be involved so that we know some students that are going to, you know, be first day of school, know that they're going to be someone on our radar that we at least want to talk to and check in with. So we're not waiting that couple of months until we see behaviors or data come back that says there might be a concern. So really using that data so that day one, we know where we're going to start for some students that we know are already going to be likely to need some additional supports, so that we're not we're not losing that time at the beginning of the school year, waiting for kind of problems to pop up, but really, again, being proactive and preventative to know that these students were already kind of getting some additional services at their previous school.
All right, so we talked a little bit about the school counseling program model and our standards. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. School counselors are not therapists. I think sometimes that gets a little confused because like we refer students to the school counselor and people think, oh, therapy. And I've had parents in the past think that as well. So we are part of the mental health team, but we do work more in the prevention, like Michelle said, the tier 1 and the multi-tiered systems of support. And then tier 2, we might run small groups, you know, or do other tier 2 interventions, but we are not therapists. We are counselors. And so if therapy is needed and or required, we do have a lot of schools and districts have clinical social workers, or we can refer out to community resources or have community resources come into the school. So I just wanted to clarify that there sometimes is some confusion about what school counselors, you know, if we're therapists, if we're doing clinical work and that type of stuff. So we are not, we are school counselors. And also in Utah, school counselors are generally found in every school because we are that tier 1 and because it's standard 1, we do meet with every student. We are found in every school. And then kind of with that multi-tiered support system, you may have school, like I said, social workers or clinical mental health, you know, counselors or school psychologists, things like that. So we all support each other on that multi-tiered systems of support, and we all kind of work in the different tiers. But I just wanted to clarify that so that there wasn't any confusion on that. Before we move on, were there any questions, comments, discussion about the school counseling program model or experiences you've had with that? Perfect. Okay, we'll move ahead and go ahead and talk about collaborating with the school counselor and the different mentors. So school counselors collaborate with various stakeholders to provide leadership and support to the school improvement plan and school climate. So some of the people we collaborate with, obviously mentors, trackers, and student advocates. We also collaborate extensively with administration, faculty, the feeder system, like Michelle mentioned in Standard 7, that cone site meeting where we meet with elementary, secondary, or middle school and high school, and often post-secondary as well. And then other educational stakeholders to develop a systemic approach to college and career readiness. We also meet with policymakers, administrators, educators, support staff, parents, and other community members to create inviting spaces where students want to spend time and enjoy learning. So we collaborate with lots of people. We are involved on lots of committees, advisory boards, school community council. And so that collaboration piece is huge for us to be able to work with our students, to be able to support our students in the best possible way. So please feel free, if you don't feel like you are collaborating with your school counselor, please feel free to reach out to them. I'm hoping they reach out to you as well, and that we can really build a strong collaboration to support our students. So again, talking about this, we consult with and partner with teachers, mentors, student advocates, staff members, and parents regularly to provide information, support the school community, receive feedback on the emerging needs of our students, and supports to address those needs. It is interesting how, and I'm sure as you've worked in different schools or areas, communities have different needs. Some communities have, specific needs in one area, maybe specific classes. I'm sure some of you have noticed, we've had classes that have come through, maybe class of 2015, where they had a very class personality and they might have needed more supports in a specific area. One of the feedback that we are getting across the state that we've been getting the past couple of years is that a lot of students are feeling very lonely, feeling like they don't have friends, feeling like they don't know how to make friends, possibly lacking social skills or friendship skills, things like that. And it's been interesting to get that data. I don't know for sure, but I think COVID had something to do with that. And so that's something I would say that we're seeing a need of, during these past 2 years. And so we could collaborate with our mentors and our advocates about, hey, we're teaching these social skills. We're teaching students, how to make friends and how to listen and how to communicate, and kind of supporting each other back and forth, so that when the school counselor is meeting with them and talking about that, the mentor is also talking about that and using the same language and supporting in that way. So that could be an example of one way that we collaborate, support our students. There are obviously times where a student may be going through something that is difficult, maybe in their home life, or at school, that is confidential, that we aren't able to share everything as school counselors, but we do want to share, what we can share and collaborate on that, so that we are supporting our students with their specific needs and in their future goals as well. So go ahead to the next one, Michelle. So I had a couple questions. When you think about your school structures, when do you, as mentors and advocates, when do you share information with the school counselors, and what information do you share with your school counselors?
We have a weekly meeting that talks about, kids that are getting ready to graduate. In our context, it's, with the detention center school and the state hospital school. And kids that are, we talk about IEPs, and we talk about any struggles that they're having, or any things that need to happen to support that kid that might be getting ready to graduate, or anything we need to do with that. So we try to connect at least weekly with a team that will talk about students that were, in need of support that way.
I love that. And you have a scheduled weekly meeting, Melanie?
Yes.
I love that. Who's included in that meeting?
The counselors, the SPED team, the administrators, the ETCA transition specialists, the registrar. That's the general standard group that will meet together. And then occasionally we'll pull in a case manager, or, if we're getting ready to transition, that they'll talk about that as well, what has to happen, what we're looking forward to happening with the student as they get ready to move on, or if we're trying to get them graduated, or whatever it is that's happening with them.
I love that. I'm so glad that you have a scheduled meeting, that we can go to this place and we'll collaborate and we'll talk about, we'll support our students. And, I love that. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
I wanted to also just highlight too the CCRs and the collaboration tool that can be for our mentors and our counselors, just so that we're all on the same page, helping our students reach the goals that they have, created for themselves. And so that's something that we at USBE are continuing to push as we go into programs, to ensure that our mentors have access to those CCRs and are part of that process.
I love that. And that, like I said, when we talked about Standard 3, that's such a huge part of what we do as school counselors. And so I love that collaboration piece and supporting our students with their post-secondary plans and goals. So in the chat, Amanda said, when my student is struggling, Kim said, on a personal note, it was great working with Michelle and her colleagues in supporting some of our youth and support kiddos at Granite Connections. It was helpful to tag team so we could know how best to support unique issues. Kudos to Michelle. I remember how she rallied to help YIC students who missed one whole year of school graduate from high school, enroll in college, have CNA certificate, access a certain significant amount of money for college. Awesome. Good job, Michelle. Jessie Ann said if student is struggling and needs extra support from the school, make up credits. Definitely, I would say credit recovery, credit remediation is a huge part also where we collaborate and work as mentors and school counselors. Any other experiences anyone would like to share?
Well, can I can I tag?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. What we do, I mean, I'm pretty sure we all do at our district, is that when we do introduce our students the first day that they are with the counselors, and we sure that they have that connection, initial connection. So whenever we are not there, they are able to connect with this student, and we follow up all the credit recovery makeups. And I do personally do some meetings with the counselor through the whole year, so I can see that everything is being followed. And if my student needs some other connection, like you're saying, psychologists or social workers in there, I will do that, and I always approach my counselors. I have been having an open door here at Jordan District, so it's just been amazingly, the help of our counselor has been amazing, honestly. I have really good experiences, and my students always that had been getting those connections, and I know that they are, anytime that they need help, they can go to the counselor because of that, that initial connection that I make when my students get to the school.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. Anyone else? So I just have another question to talk about a little bit, and this is where I think we work also as school counselors. Suicide prevention is a big part of what we do. We usually go in with, to different classrooms and talk about sources of strength or Hope Squad or whatever it is that the school or community has decided to use for our suicide prevention program. Is there a formal process in your schools or in your collaboration for when a student reports high levels of concern? And how does that work?
We do have a couple of YIC specialists and directors on here if we want to play pick and choose, just FYI.
Amanda, I will let you pick and choose if you want to do that.
Fair enough. Well, it's because I'm genuinely curious about the answer to this question, and I realize it will probably vary slightly by school or LEA, but I do see a few folks like Ignacio Garcia and Mike Willis is on here with us. If either of you would be willing to share what your process is with students who show high levels of concern. Oh, Mike got his camera on. Hooray! Hi, Mike.
Hey, Amanda, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Okay. I'm listening intently, but I'm also writing my school-based mental health grant at the same time. So repeat the question, if you will.
So is there a protocol set in place for students who report high levels of concerns to a mentor or an advocate?
Yeah, we've worked really hard on this. We've actually with YIC and with some of our mental health issues, high-risk students are a top priority. We do have a lot of meetings with the powers that be that kind of govern over that. We are in the process right now of developing and implementing a early warning system for students that are high risk. And then we're using that kind of as a screener per se, and we've hired LCSWs for each of our schools. We call them mental health specialists in our district that work. And so there's a process by using the counselor as the first line of defense. And then with the administration and the counselor, they look at what resources are available, and then to what degree the student is at risk and what resources we have available and wraparound services and so forth. And then it trickles over into our mental health specialist to sit down with them and perhaps even get parents involved and so forth, and kind of see what we can do to solve some of the issues that they may be having. And so, yeah, it's kind of a group effort. And we work really hard to really look at office referrals and certain, if a kid, in our new early warning system process, we've looked at grading, we're using 3 indicators. We're looking at grades, and sometimes it's more about where a kid was, and if they've just kind of dropped off, that indicates that this child is at a higher risk. If their grades have plummeted for whatever reason, we kind of look into the background there. We look at office referrals as far as behavior. And then in general, well, when I talk about grades, we talk about GPA. So it's more of an ongoing process over the last 3 years or so. We kind of monitor grading that way, and also look for reasons to celebrate if a child is going on in the opposite direction and actually raising their grades and so forth. We want to kind of look at the whole child and see, is the things that we're doing, is it working, or what can we do better to get the kids the help that they need. But yeah, we're constantly meeting throughout the month with different groups, including the counselors, the special mental health specialists, the administration. We have people hired in our district at a limited basis at each of our schools that are called refocus specialists to work with those students. So we're really looking at the whole child, and especially those that are at risk. This early warning system, we have our programmers that are currently making it possible so that it gives a priority list of students that we really should be concerned about, and then again looking at what we can do with the resources available to us, and if not, look for community resources that might help as well.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I also appreciate the collaboration that occurs between not just school counselors and advocates, but all involved in the educational community that are supporting these students. So thank you for sharing that.
You bet. Thank you.
So Jessie Ann Bodell said that Canyons has a protocol: contact the school social worker, counselor, and administration, and then contact the parents. I know in some schools, some LEAs, they would have the person who was reported to contact the parents, and in others, it may be the school counselor or social worker or administrator who would contact the parents. So it's just it's important to know what the protocol is for your school with these, intensive situations that sometimes come up. So, and I'm sure that you've been trained on that. And again, every LEA might have a slightly different plan or protocol. So one other thing that I really wanted to highlight is the collaboration between mentors and school counselors. It really promotes that connect interventions that are supportive and personalized for students. Our students are individuals, and they do have individual needs, as you all know, and they've all gone through their own experiences, their own life path. And so I think it's really important that we connect. If something stands out to you with a student that would be really great for the school counselor to be aware of, please share that, and vice versa. School counselors, if they become aware of, hey, Jimmy hates school, absolutely, but he loves cooking. hey, let's support that. Let's, talk about the different individual things that we can do in intervention. So I just love that collaboration between mentors and school counselors does support the connectiveness with our students. And then the next slide.
Is it going?
No.
Okay.
We paused too long. Oh, there you go.
So I just want to just quickly add in, I love the conversation that's happening, and also that positive call home. I know we've probably talked about that a lot in all of your trainings and as you're working with students, but just always remember how positive that can be to have that call home of like, hey, this is the school and Jimmy's not in trouble. Jimmy was awesome today, right? And that just builds relationships with the school. So when we do have to make those calls that he's in trouble, we already have that foundation of a relationship and that previous positive experience. So I know sometimes it can be difficult when we're talking about, students that are in need and having these concerns, but also I think Michael mentioned this, also recognizing those students that are succeeding and having successes to really kind of praise that and give them more support and encouragement as well. So really kind of doing both ends of that. And then Bethany mentioned this already of really making sure you're reporting as necessary. And my rule of thumb is like, if you're asking the question, should I tell somebody about this? The answer is always yes. Right. So if you've asked the question, make sure you're passing along that information and just really have that collaboration with the school counselor. I know that they might seem super busy and they have so much to do and they have so many students, but we need to make sure that we're having those important conversations and really putting the needs of students first, even ahead of maybe some of our USBE requirements of paperwork and things like that, right? So really making sure that students are always coming first. So that kind of brings us to our conclusion slide here of really speaking to how students and families really have the best outcomes when we're all on the same team. It's not counselors versus parents or versus teachers, right? We're all on the same team student and really making sure that those collaborations are open and transparent and really just keeping everyone in the loop and we're not being siloed in our work. So we're not duplicating efforts. I know in my experience, we had a lot of students that didn't have picture IDs. And that created a barrier for them as they were trying to kind of move on and get jobs and do testing and things like that. And so having a clear kind of outline of who's going to do what in that process. So two people aren't both supporting the student to, find their birth certificate when someone else was already doing that, right? So really making sure that although we all want to support that student, that we're communicating with each other so that we're using our time really wisely and helping that student to meet those goals, right? And have those outcomes. So we've been talking a lot about things. We're up here at USBE, not working with students every day. So you are all the ones that deserve like a big bio and welcome this morning because you're the ones out there doing this work, working with students. And we know how hard it is, especially since the pandemic has started. There has been a lot going on in our world. It's even impacting us adults. So definitely impacting students that you work with. So just thank you for the work that you're doing to support the students and their families, the communities, even some staff members maybe, right? So really just thank you for the work that you're doing. And if you have questions about school counseling, about how you can maybe collaborate with your counselor, anything at all, please don't hesitate to email Bethany or myself with any questions or anything we can do to support. And that's all that we have for today. If there are any questions or follow-up from anything.
Hi, this is Rita Brock, and I am the prevention specialist for bullying, gangs, child sexual abuse, and human trafficking. Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to add that when I was in the classroom, which was a long time ago, more than 20 years ago, and we did not have all these procedures. And I am so thankful that the legislators and mandated schools and districts to produce this procedure. But what I have done in my classroom many years ago, I was in charge of the newcomer programs, which is a program for English language learners that have either never had any level of literacy because they were prisoners of they were in a concentration camp or of war or whatever, and or because they just did not speak a word of English because they just came to this country. One student that I particularly remember was an LGBT, and once I got to know him again, that connection is so important. Once I got to know him, I found out that he had somehow came to the United States by himself. He was only 16. He had nightmares because he has gone through so many horrible things in his life. And I kind of read the signs of suicide. And so what I did is, first of all, he would not go into the cafeteria with all the others. And he was just terrified. And so I started having lunch with him at the cafeteria. Then I discovered that he was really good in music. He had a beautiful voice, but he didn't know anything in music. And so I got him with other teachers. I collaborated with other teachers and put him into the choir. And slowly but slowly, I think I've helped him a little bit. The reason I'm sharing this experience is because I think it's so crucial for us that are working directly with the children to get to know the students, take the time. Of course, the curriculum is important, the standards are important, but the personal connection, it is so important. It makes a difference in the student's life. So thank you all in the classroom.
Thanks, Rita. I absolutely agree that connection is really important as a foundation so we can have those academic successes as well.
I would just like to add something that I've seen happen as far as mentoring and suicide prevention. We have had mentors that are worried about kids when they move from one district to another, reach out to the mentor or group that they're going to, and make sure that they're aware and share the concerns so that the new mentor doesn't have to take time to figure out what's going on. They already have that information. So collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. And you all are welcome to come off mute or jump in the chat. We still do have about 10 minutes with our two counseling specialists here.
I'm trying not to talk too much, but Amanda, I love your point of being proactive in that. So we know that students may be moving to different places. So having that plan in place of like when we see a student is, moving to a different program, a different school, to know that like this is our summary sheet that we're going to use to make sure that they have that information from day one. So we can really make sure that there's support during that time of transition, which, as I already mentioned, would be great for that student to kind of have that continual service of, hey, I had a mentor at this last school and now day one at this new program, here's another mentor.
Not that I don't love awkward silence, but I do like to honor and respect everyone's time just as much. And I do see that Dr. Semenick, if I could say it right, has joined us today. So I will give you guys one more chance to ask Bethany or Michelle a question. And if we don't have any, we'll go ahead and turn time over for the next presentation.
Amanda, I just wanted to jump on the back of Michelle and say thank you again for all that you do. We appreciate the work that you do with students. I know it can be hard and sometimes you go home and stress about, is this kiddo going to be okay? Are they going to be okay at home? Maybe it's a home situation that's not the best. And I know because I've done that for many, many years myself. And so again, just thank you for all that you do. And we really appreciate that collaboration.
Thank you, Bethany. I know I've heard from many mentors that the school counselor is their advocate and their go-to in the school in many cases. So, and as Kathy Davis always says, never worry alone. So when you are worried about a kid, please go work with your counselor or your mentor or somebody, the advocate, somebody from the team. Thank you so much, Bethany and Michelle. I love hearing about the school counselors. I had goosebumps when you told the numbers because I used to support the program in 2016, I think it was. So to hear about the expansion and the addition, it gave me goosebumps. I love it. So keep up the good work and thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to present. I appreciate you both.
Thanks.
All right, so with that, like I said, Dr. Semenick is with us, so I will go ahead and make her a co-host real quick, and then she should have rights to start sharing her screen and such.
Okay, let's see if I can get this going.
It always takes a minute, right?
Right, yes, of course. Okay, let's see. Trying to look at the presenter view so I can have my notes.
I understand that. And for me, it always like changes which screen I'm playing on.
Right, exactly. Let's see, it says presenter view. But I'm not getting my notes. Does anybody know any little tricks for this?
Screen?
What was that?
Do you have more than one screen?
I do not. I just have the one.
It might be a challenge. I'm trying to figure out. Because I believe if you put it in the other, yeah, try that one.
No.
You could send it to Amanda or I, and we could share, and then you could be looking at it
And have your notes
on your own screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that now.
Thank you, Leah. And since Leah chimed in, let's give Leah a shout out because the reason Dr. Semenick is here with us today is Leah. She arranged this presentation for me and I so very much appreciate you because I know your schedule is probably crazier than everybody's. So thank you so much.
But I'm excited.
I know, right? I woke up this morning like, yeah, today's going to be a fun webinar. I know we have discovered we get excited about some of the most interesting things at the Board of Ed.
So Amanda, I would like to know more about Dr. Semenick while she's figuring out the PowerPoint. Would you mind just giving some highlights of Dr. Semenick?
Yeah, while she's doing that, let me go back. She did share, I don't think you were with us, Rita, when I introduced her. So let me just share that again. So,
you know, I was in another meeting.
And that's how it always
You
is.
know how it goes. You
No
just
worries.
hop from one meeting to the other.
No problem. This
So
gives
I am so sorry. I missed
It's okay.
that part.
We're still waiting on the presentation to come through, so that's not a problem. She moved to Utah from Kentucky about 2 years ago, and in Kentucky, she had completed her doctorate in clinical psychology at Eastern Kentucky University and dedicated her focus to working with children, adolescents, and adults in inpatient and outpatient settings with an emphasis on assessing and treating trauma, thought disorders, and personality diagnosis. She completed her residency in forensic psychology at the Utah State Hospital with a secondary focus in neuropsychology, and she was hired at the hospital following her fellowship. So she is still at the state hospital with us. And I am just going to refresh. Did you send that to me or to Leah?
I sent that to you.
Okay.
Did that go through?
Not yet, but I'm just hitting the refresh button on my email, hoping it will pop in any second here.
Okay.
And if you have anything else you want to share with the group, you're welcome to.
Well, I love Utah. It's been a really, really great experience here. Whenever I matched to be at the Utah State Hospital, I was like, oh, skiing, this is going to be great. But then found all the hiking and made me stay.
I love stories like that. Like I've talked to people who have come out for a vacation and then like they just never went home.
Right. Yes.
Well, it hasn't come through just yet. Doing the force update. Let's see if that'll help. Leah, have you had any luck on your end? Or was it just me that you sent it to, Megan?
Yeah.
I think I just sent it to you.
Fair enough.
Me-
Oh, my
It's
phone
a-
has vibrated, which is a good sign because my phone
Yeah.
usually gets it first.
It's a big PowerPoint, so
Oh.
it probably just is taking a minute.
There we go. That is exactly right, Leah. Oh, technology. We love it.
Yes. I know you'd think after all the pandemic stuff, I would be more used to navigating the computer.
Well, I think it's because we have to switch back and forth. At least for me, that I think is the challenge. Okay, I think I should be sharing the correct screen now.
Perfect.
Chat on it. Let me drag it off. There we go. All right, take it away.
Okay. And so would the best thing for me to do just be like, okay, like go to the next slide?
Yeah,
don't
that
know if
works.
Control
Absolutely.
over that.
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, so neuropsychology of developmental trauma. So this is a really big passion of mine. I definitely nerd out about reading and learning more about how people can react to trauma and how that impacts people differently. We can go on to the next slide. So these are the 3 books that I primarily use throughout the presentation. There's a great amount of research in each of these. And so I'll try to refer to them throughout the presentation. But if at the end anyone has any questions, like where did you get that source and that kind of thing, like I'm happy to look and make sure where I see that and let you know. Okay, going on to the next slide. Okay, so I think that this is a really good way of saying like why this matters so much. And as you'll see, there's some pretty big statistics on there where it's, 1 in 5 were sexually molested as a child, 1 in 4 grew up with alcoholic relatives, these kind of things. These statistics might be surprising or maybe not. I think that it really shows that almost everyone has been touched by trauma at some point in their life. And that's why it's really important to understand it a little bit better. And so I have a quote by Bessel van der Kolk from the book, The Body Keeps the Score. And I think that it really wraps up how this presentation is meant to be shared. So it says, as human beings, we belong to an extremely resilient species. Since time immemorial, we have rebounded from our relentless wars, countless disasters, both natural and man-made, and the violence and betrayal in our own lives. But traumatic experience do leave traces, whether on a large scale in history and culture, or close to home on our families, with dark secrets being imperceptibly passed down through generations. They also leave traces on our minds and emotions, on our capacity for joy and intimacy, and even our biology and immune system. And so I really love that quote because it really shows how sometimes when people think of trauma, they automatically think of, like flashbacks. And of course, that's definitely part of it. But trauma can really impact how you see yourself, the world, the future. It impacts our immune systems. And then going through this, I'm going to show how it really impacts the brain. So going to the next slide. And so I want to make this as interactive as possible. So please don't be shy. I love talking, but I love listening too. So looking at bias, this is what makes us human. We all have it, right? Myself included. So however you'd like to participate, if you want to jot down some of these answers for yourself, if you want to shout them out, I'm really happy. But looking at how you might see some of the kids you work with, do you treat them all the same? How do you think they got that way? What do you all think?
So I find I have like I don't know, it's a weird habit. When I find kids that have similarities and commonalities, like it's easier to be nice to them, you know, and it's easier to feel like the bond is going to be there and I don't have to work for it as hard, which is not always the case, you know, just because we might both have similar interests does not mean that personality wise we are going to be similar.
Mhm.
I'd like to speak to that. I had an experience at one of the schools with two boys who will not go to class. They're at school, but they will not go to class. And I tried working with the teachers. I said, let's do something to encourage them to be to class. And I wanted a reward system for them. And the teacher said, I am not giving a reward to a bad kid. I will give that reward to the kid who shows up every day. And I'm thinking, they're missing the point. We're trying to do something that encourages them, making them feel welcome, making them to try for something. And so when you talk about biases, that was the hardest one for me is, you know, they aren't bad kids. They talk to me, they're very pleasant, but they're just terrified of being in class and they will not go. They will not. But we're glad to have them there. So when you say, do you treat them all the same? You can't. The kids are the easy ones. They come to class, they do the work. You can talk to them, and these kids total resistant. So all I can do is throw any good thing at them that I can. And some of them are sticking. It's really weird. So you work where you are, where they are.
What a great example. Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to speak to that as well. I know we're getting down to the end of the year, and one of the things that comes up this time each year in our district is our teachers, our principals, administrators, for those types of students that are difficult, like was mentioned, you know, we have like the Bees game that is sponsored to kind of help those kids. Some of these kids, at least in our district, I'm sure several others in kind of a rural central Utah area, they don't have those opportunities hardly ever. And that's kind of the way it was designed, to give those kids that are more difficult, the kids that struggle a little bit, something as a reward. But our problem is our administrators, our teachers, they find reasons to exclude those kids from an activity like that, which they need. It's like holding a kid that's really rambunctious out from recess in the elementary school when you know they really need that, and you take that away, and it in some ways it kind of punishes the teacher because they don't realize that that's what that kid is looking for. And I think we talk a lot about relationships in our district from top to bottom. If you know, a kid will not learn from you if they don't like you. That's pure and simple. And somewhere along the line, I try and get our teachers and our principals to start asking the question, not what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. And if they would just change that narrative just enough, I think that they would start getting a lot better return on their investment, and those kids would actually open up and they would have less problems. So that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, I think that that's a great example as well. So a big part of what actually got me into psychology was my mom was an emotional behavioral disorder teacher at an alternative school. And, you know, she would come home with all of these stories of these kids. And in my head, I'm like, wow, like they really need some extra help. I kind of want to figure that out. So that was a big part of what got me into psychology in the first place. And so for my own example, when I was in Kentucky, I used to work at this psychiatric hospital just as a psych tech. And there was this girl there, she was an adolescent. And, you know, a lot of people saw her as just mean. She did it on purpose. She was aggressive towards her peers, difficult at bedtime, stole, you know, all of these negative things. And so it's really easy to make those quick judgments. You know, she's doing it on purpose. She's purposefully doing this. Or you might even hear the term manipulative, which is something that I think we all really need to try to stay away from. So with something like this, I think it's important to take a different approach. As Walt Whitman said, you know, be curious, not judgmental. And so this was an extremely short vignette, of course, but how might you apply that statement to this girl that I was just describing?
don't know if this is a clean tie, but we did have a comment in the chat, and what I took away from it is the mentor asks what happened to you, not what's wrong with you.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes, and so I think with something like this, it's important to make those adjustments. And it's not always going to be appropriate to ask people about their trauma, but you can ask them, how is it that you want to be treated? And so an adjustment I made, I know when I was a psych tech, I would get the kids' attention by maybe like putting my hand on their shoulders. And I've learned that that's something that I absolutely shouldn't do moving forward. A lot of people don't like to be touched. That was something I learned with her case is, I don't like for people to approach me when I can't see you. That was something that was very startling for her. And so being able to make those little adjustments. Okay, I'm going to the next slide. So this is going to be the structure of the PowerPoint where we're going to go over a lot of different brain basics. And I'm going to try to take a funnel approach on going like very broad and then going to more narrow details about the brain and the functions. We're also going to look at the impact of emotion and perception and how that interacts with our brain structures. Then we'll go over trauma, looking at different definitional terms, symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and how it can manifest in a lot of different ways. And then finally, we're going to try to have that synthesis of how chronic trauma or trauma early on in life can really have that impact on the brain. And then we can go to the next slide. Okay, so here's the big question. Does experience shape the brain, or does brain structure and function shape behavior? What do you all think?
I think experience shapes the brain. What you go through, what you feel, every emotion. It's like when you play the piano, you create these patterns in your brain. And the more you practice and practice, it reinforces and reinforces. And the same thing happens when something bad happens to us and you have a response and you find what works to get away from that. Everybody wants to avoid pain and suffering. And so we create behaviors or thought processes that help us either avoid it or and unknowingly we might be reinforcing it with the experience over and over again. This is how, I'm bad, or mom's bad, or I better not talk, or think of the things that kids do to keep themselves out of whatever this little painful situation is. Like we talk about manipulative. Somebody once said that all behavior is purposeful. We do things for a reason. And so maybe not to manipulate, but to have some control over what happens to us. Anyway, I could talk forever.
Yes, no, I really appreciate all of the comments. And I saw some comments in the chat. Some people were guessing experiences, some people were guessing both. And so through this, I'm hoping to show how both actually have such a huge impact. So the answer is kind of yes. Okay, going to the next slide. Okay, going into brain basics and then going on to that next slide again. Okay, so first we'll look at the two sides of the brain. So overall, while the brain is divided in half, each side have its efficiencies, but it is symmetrical. So they have very similar components. So overall, one could consider left as servant to the right hemisphere. The right identifies emotions faster, more accurately, and is attuned with nonverbal communication. It's strongly connected with our emotions, and it helps with having a sense of humor, but also shows a lot of primary roles with empathy, theory of mind, and social interactions. So this is really inherent early on as it goes into factors with forming attachment with the primary caregivers. And then with the left side, conversely, it's very efficient with routine. It works well with putting things into context, and it's very heavily reliant on vocabulary. And go to the next slide. And then looking a little bit more broader at the lobes, it's helpful to conceptualize the brain as developing up then out. So it starts with the brain stem, which is kind of in the back of the head connected to the rest of your body. So this is a big part of what keeps us alive through the unconscious necessities, such as blood flow and breathing, your hunger, those kinds of things. So, and then with the occipital lobes, that's actually in the back of your brain, as you'll see on the picture. So that largely helps with eyesight. And whenever people kind of fall, hit their head, they might say, oh, I feel like I'm seeing stars. It's because you're hitting the eyesight part of your brain. The temporal lobes are on each half, and this is primarily involved with hearing, language, and memory integration. The parietal lobe is on top, and that helps us with kind of our sense of space and time. And the last part of our brain to develop, both evolutionarily and within our own development, is that prefrontal cortex, or this frontal part of the brain. So that's not actually fully developed till maybe the mid-20s. And so sometimes when we have these expectations of kids to be able to make really complex decisions, they don't have a fully formed frontal lobe. That's something to keep in mind. But it allows us to observe what's going on, predict different outcomes, and make decisions. So being able to calmly hover over our emotions, the situation at hand, that's what really allows for the inhibition, organization, and control over our emotional reactions. And the frontal lobe is largely what makes us human. And so that's why it's discussed in psychology so much. You can go to the next slide. And so the brain is really built as a hierarchy, so from bottom up, to keep us alive. And so a good way to understand this is, I'll try to have my hand in here, but you can kind of understand these parts of the brain kind of like as a fist. So this bottom part's going to be that brain stem, those functions that really work to keep us alive. And so in the middle is our limbic system that has to do with the hippocampus, amygdala, and hypothalamus. And then over top is that prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobes. And so what's important about this is a lot of times the limbic system and the prefrontal lobes cannot function fully at the same time. And so, for example, let's say that you consciously choose to hold your breath. So because that is a function that keeps us alive, the brainstem is going to make you breathe. And another example of that is, let's say that you have a perceived threat. So that's your limbic system that's reacting to that. And during a perceived threat, when you're feeling really overwhelmed, it's really difficult to think clearly and make good decisions. And that's because this frontal part is offline. So if the limbic system is really going, then this is not. And so what I'll try to explain throughout this is there are a lot of different in the moment coping skills to turn on this part of your brain. And that can be engaging thought. So sometimes if somebody's feeling really overwhelmed, if you ask them things that take thought, then that can soothe the limbic system and turn on this frontal part of the brain. And that can be really really simple things. It can be like, when's your best friend's birthday? When's your birthday? What's the capital of Texas? You know, like that turns on that front part of the brain. Okay, let me go to the next slide. Okay, so diving more deeply into the limbic system, this is what really controls the fight, flight, or freeze responses. So these are all kind of that call to action whenever there's danger. So the amygdala quickly perceives sensory information, so eyesight, hearing, touch, those kinds of things, and it processes that information through our memories to determine an appropriate emotional reaction. So if this fire alarm is triggered, it sends notifications to the thalamus, then the cerebral cortex, and emotional reactions can be really quick and not always accurate. So it's important to remember that negative emotions and are adaptive and evolutionary, because this is what helps to keep us alive and it motivates us in the right direction. So these emotions become maladaptive when they're unable to return to baseline. So for example, an individual that does not have trauma, let's say that their baseline is here, and up here is that big emotional reaction. There's a lot of space. So that gives time for being able to self-soothe, think about it, those kinds of things. Whereas let's say somebody with trauma, their baseline might be here. So they're going to hit that a lot more often, and it's going to be a more extreme reaction. And so the hippocampus in this part of the limbic system is what contextualizes our experiences through the who and the where factors. The hypothalamus reacts to change in our environment as well as our emotions, so that internal and external change that's going on. So for example, if someone's tone of voice changes, that's a very slight change in our environment, but that might lead to negative emotions and then defensive behaviors. And that's a big thing throughout therapy and psychology, is that understanding that our thoughts are related to our emotions are related to our behaviors. We can go to the next slide. So the limbic system is basically the map of relation between you and your surroundings, providing emotional relevance, categorization, and perception. So information comes through those senses and to the thalamus acting as the cook. So there's an exception with this, with the sense of smell that goes straight to the thalamus, making it a lot more primitive. So the thalamus stirs all the input from our perceptions into a fully blended autobiographical soup. And so that really allows an integrated, coherent experience of this is what's happening to me right now. So it's important to remember that reality can be interpreted in many ways, leading to different perceptions for the same event. So sensations are passed to the amygdala, acting as the smoke detector to identify if it's relevant to our survival. The hippocampus adds if this new sensation is connected to past experiences. If the amygdala senses a threat, it instantly alerts the hypothalamus and brainstem to recruit stress hormones and the automatic nervous system to have a full body reaction. So the amygdala really decides if something's a threat before it even enters our consciousness. And so if the interpretation of threat by the amygdala is too intense, or this filtering system is weak, which is both common in PTSD, people lose control over their automatic emergency responses, and that results in that prolonged startle or aggressive outbursts. The smoke detector is usually good at picking up clues for danger, but when someone has past trauma, this has an increased chance for misinterpreting safe situations as dangerous. And go to the next slide. So we've gone over what's going on internally, but now let's look at the environment and how that really plays a role. So it's really important to not over-pathologize people. Some people may just have a more active limbic system or more of those responses, and that can be based off temperament. And data really shows that temperament remains pretty much the same from womb to tomb. So let's talk about the population you all work with. Why might they be vigilant in their environment?
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so just looking at the kids that you all work with, I'm sure that some of them might appear anxious, on guard, irritable, any of those kinds of things. Why might they be that way?
Well, the easiest answer is it's a defense mechanism
Mm-hmm.
first.
Mm-hmm.
Anger is always the easiest emotion to access.
Mm-hmm.
Covers a lot of other ones.
I would imagine that they're tired all the time because they're being so vigilant. and they're always having to be prepared for possible changes in their environment or trauma. And I think we do see kids that are tired and they become irritable because they're trying to manage all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And another way to look at this is their primitive brain is firing, but those frontal lobes just aren't developed enough to rein it in. And so an example of this might be, I do a lot of forensic work. And so if I go see a kid in juvenile detention, let's say he's in detention for trespassing or something like that, and I ask him, what do you think's going to happen to you? And then their response is, oh, probably death row. You know, an adult is going to have, or hopefully have, those abilities kind of to rein things back in, take in the context, to appreciate what's going on. Whereas without that full frontal lobe development, that's impaired. So what's important is a lot of these things can be modeled. It's not all just biologically based. So if mom and dad react with rage, that's going to be normalized. And then conversely, if who they see reacts to difficult situations with more of that calm demeanor, good eye contact, soothing voice, then that can be normalized as well. And anxiety in general is that anticipation of threat. And then that imminent feeling that something bad is definitely going to happen is that trepidation. So maintaining constant vigilance, as you were saying, takes a lot of energy. It can lead to a lot of physical fatigue. Active avoidance to this feeling of uneasiness is really common in generalized anxiety disorder. And that's showing that not only do you have fear of that one thing, such as maybe like a phobia, but there's fear of so many things in your environment, trying to have control over what can set off that limbic system. And go to the next slide. So fear is experienced through the vagal system in response to a current threat. So because emotions are evolutionary and adaptive, I'll try to use examples from our cave brothers and sisters a long time ago. So the sympathetic nervous system motivates behavior through instinct. And so that might be choosing to fight or run away from a bear. If the threat is overwhelming, say it's a really big bear, the parasympathetic nervous system initiates that freeze response. And so that makes the person kind of appear dead in the past. But now that really shuts down emotional arousal, that slows heart rate and blood pressure. And so how you might see that today is that person just looks disengaged or like they don't care. So because we fortunately are not fleeing from bears on a weekly basis, our fears are more aligned with our social roles and relationships. So a child in fear of being disciplined may become argumentative. They may deny the behavior happened at all, or they might appear as if they don't care. And so those are 3 examples of that fight, flight, freeze in today's day. And anxiety and depression are really becoming more recognized as 2 sides of the same coin. They show a lot of overlapping symptoms, and one often leads to the other. So chronic trauma like domestic violence or even repeated invalidating experiences, such as with emotional abuse, is similar in that trauma reactions can lead to anxiety, can lead to depression, and so on and so forth if not treated. You can go to the next slide. So stress hormones like cortisol or adrenaline help get the body ready to fight or flee by shutting down functions that don't help and turning on functions to maximize needed muscle groups. So typically, once the danger is past, the body returns to its normal state fairly quickly. But when recovery is blocked and the body is triggered to defend itself, it makes people feel agitated and on guard. And that can be really common for individuals with a borderline personality disorder, kind of like we were saying with the different levels of baselines. Somebody with a borderline personality disorder is going to start high, but they're also going to have that quick reaction and a very slow come down, whereas others might be more fluid. So your frontal lobes start to develop that tunnel vision of shutting down rational thought. So trauma can affect the brain both chronically and permanently. So war veterans are known to have smaller hippocampus and a more active limbic system after discharge. So long-term potentiation, which is when neural pathways keep getting activated, gets easier to activate and stays active longer. And so using that example of somebody who's a war veteran, let's say they become sensitive to the sound of gunfire. Makes sense. They come home, there's not gunfire, but they might hear something like a firework. And so while they might know cognitively that that's not a gunshot, their body still reacts as if it is. And so there's that quick response and then slow come down because of that trauma reaction. Okay, and go to the next one. So neurons and neural pathways, that all shows our genetic blueprint along with epigenetic or experience-dependent expressions of genes. So memory formation creates a complex neural communication system throughout the nervous system. It's made of synaptic and dendritic connections modulated by neurochemicals. So chronic stress leads to that cortisol production, which can be neurotoxic to the brain and lead to cell death. And you can actually see this in MRIs where it'll look like there are lesions in the brain, and that's from that cell death of chronically having those stress hormones firing. And so a lot of times we'll use those psychotropic medications, such as SSRIs and those kinds of things, and that regulates the availability of neurotransmitters, such as serotonin. You can go to the next slide. So now we're going to switch gears and talk more about trauma and just understanding that better. You can go to the next slide. So according to the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, a clinically significant trauma is defined as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence by directly experiencing, witnessing, or learning of a traumatic event occurring to you, a close family member or friend, or experiencing repeated exposures to aversive details of a traumatic event. And that can happen with police officers, first responders, that kind of thing. And so looking at types of trauma, and acute trauma is something that happened one time, such as a home invasion. Chronic is repeated and prolonged, and that can be something like domestic violence. And then complex trauma is exposure to a variety of different traumas over an extended period of time. And that often has to do with interpersonal interactions. You can go to the next slide. So trauma disorders were actually given very little importance until the Vietnam War, when veterans returned home with that shell shock or delayed reactions to trauma. So a consequence showed that about 3 times as many soldiers died at home over those lost in the battlefield. Many Vietnam veterans that reintegrated into society had worse outcomes than those that stayed in the military because they weren't able to integrate successfully. So using those maladaptive coping skills, such as drinking, using drugs, isolating. And then, of course, before the war, people still struggled with PTSD. It just wasn't as recognized. And I think moving forward, having more of this information out there really helps to lower stigmatization. And then going on to the next slide. So a large contributor to trauma are different forms of interpersonal abuse. So physical abuse can be results of markings on the skin from blunt force or penetrating trauma. Sexual abuse results from unwanted touch as a result of force, threats, or taking advantage of an individual without consent. Not all sexual abuse is through touch. There are also cases in which individuals are made to view pornography, nudity, or expose themselves against their will. Emotional abuse occurs through belittling, insulting, or threatening the person to the point of feeling ashamed, inferior, or degraded. And then that chronic invalidation is also quite harmful and results in difficulty understanding emotions in adulthood. And so an example of this is if a kid says, I feel scared, I feel sad, and then somebody invalidates saying, no, you don't. You don't feel scared or sad. No, you're tough. Those kinds of things. Internally, the kid might think, I thought what I was feeling was ABC. I thought that that was what fear felt like. You're saying that that's wrong. Now I don't know what that emotion is, and that can carry into adulthood. And then neglect, having not enough food, not having consistent shelter, those kinds of things can also lead to hoarding behaviors. We can go to the next slide. So attachment styles form in the first few years of life, depending on the caregiver's warmth and consistency in meeting needs. About 80% of individuals have a secure attachment, and a secure attachment combined with the cultivation of competency builds an internal locus of control, which is a key factor in being able to cope. So a lack of warmth and structure can lead to insecure attachments. So with insecure attachments, you have avoidant, which is when infants kind of look like nothing bothers them, don't cry when their mother leaves, ignore them whenever they return. However, research shows that these kind of kids have chronically raised heart rates, showing a constant state of hyperarousal. And many mothers of avoidant children seem to have trouble touching or snuggling children, as well as using pleasant facial expressions or vocals. Anxious or ambivalent children constantly draw attention to themselves by crying, yelling, clinging, seemingly concluding that they are not going to obtain the attention that's needed unless there's more of that spectacle. They become really upset whenever the mother leaves, but then remain unconsolable upon return. Even though they don't seem to enjoy the company, they remain like that angrily focused. And then anxious toddlers tend to grow into anxious adults, while avoidant toddlers tend to be out of touch with their feelings, with others and themselves, and that can result in bullying behaviors. And disorganized children typically identify their caregiver as both a source of this is who's going to keep me alive, but this is also who I'm very afraid of. So that results in that freeze response and not really understanding how to deal with that situation at such a young age. And a lot of time, children whose mothers were diagnosed with PTSD or depression were more likely to have significant emotional problems and be hyperaggressive. And it's important to know, while our attachment style can largely stick with us, it's also malleable. So if somebody has an insecure attachment style when they're young, that doesn't necessarily mean that it will continue that way into adulthood. And the way to change that is having those healthy, consistent relationships. Go to the next slide. So along with attachment, you have your home environment that shapes your early years. So the ACEs study stands for Adversive Childhood Experiences. These include aspects such as abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. It shows that having 4 or more ACEs increases the likelihood of learning and behavioral problems. And then having 6 or more increases the likelihood of suicide attempt. So chronologically, you have that temperament, which you're born with, attachment during those first 2 years of life, and then interactions with your environment. And so this is going to all color from a very young age how you see the world, if you see it as safe or dangerous, and how you interact with the world is largely going to be how people interact with you. So if you're defensive and aggressive, people might not treat you very well. Okay, next slide. So about 50% of children that face life-threatening events develop PTSD. Exposure to violence is correlated with the parent's education level, and PTSD in children results in changes in worldviews. Like I said, kind of having a colored version of the world being very dangerous, having low expectations for future happiness, and that can impact moral development. So young children often show sleep disturbances that can be repeated nightmares, having trouble falling asleep, fear of being alone, having a lot of irritability. That trauma creates uncertainty, and to work through this, a lot of times you'll see children acting it out or playing with dolls, like showing that trauma over and over. And that's the brain trying to work out, what is it that happened? How can we prevent it in the future? And children who repeatedly witness violence in the home, especially, are going to use that as problem solving. So if they often see violence or verbal aggression in the home, that's how they're going to use with conflict with others. So in those kind of situations, it can be really important to ask about trauma, what's going on at home, in the case of needing to report something. And then older children or adolescents are more likely to develop depressive symptoms. So this is a different presentation than younger children. So they view their response to trauma as weird and different, and that's going to make them isolate from other people, not want to talk about what happened. They're more likely to have somatic symptoms, so having a lot of headaches, stomach aches pretty consistently, and they can become very apathetic toward themselves and their body, and that can lead to feeling like they're dispensable, and lead to really dangerous acts as a distraction. And go to the next slide. And so interpersonal trauma can become very cyclical, especially in rural or impoverished communities where people are less likely to leave, have fewer resources, and a heightened stigma. So women that forfeit income and relationships with friends and family are especially vulnerable to these kinds of abuse. Those that leave domestic violence relationships are at a risk for homelessness or even death from retaliation. For those that grew up in a household with domestic violence, that can be a learned behavior or a learned norm. So sometimes you might see teens, adolescents, or even adults go from one unhealthy relationship to another. That's not purposeful. Of course, nobody wants to be in an unhealthy relationship. But when people have those kinds of characteristics, that's familiar. It almost feels better to stick with what you know than to go out on a limb with what you don't. And so they have that comfort in consistency, even if it's not good for them. So rape and violence against women have been some of the least recognized human rights issues. Very few assaults against women get reported to the police, which makes it kind of stick. And it makes sense that it doesn't get reported all the time because there are those secondary traumas from the legal system. And so I worked in the Center of Women and Families in Kentucky, and that was part of a group that would go to emergency rooms to visit people who were just victims of domestic violence or sexual assault. And what you saw was a lot of that cognitive things with domestic violence of, oh, well, it's not going to happen again. And that can keep people in that kind of relationship, is they love them. They think it's not going to happen again. It was actually my fault, those kinds of things. We can go to the next slide. And so looking at a lot of these common symptoms of trauma, one of the things that people think of the most are those intrusive thoughts, feelings, memories. That can be those flashbulb memories, which is kind of like a picture of something terrible that happened in the past that's showing up while you're at school or while you're trying to focus on something or even trying to have fun on something. That can be really intrusive in people's lives. And avoidance is pretty much the hallmark of trauma. That's what keeps people stuck in trauma, is avoiding thinking about those memories or avoiding people, situations. That really makes the trauma kind of build in their mind. It's really important through therapy to face that head on, usually cognitively. But you also have that hypervigilance, which is the body being on constant alert for danger with an extreme startle response and to unexpected situations, having those intense reactions. that can persist through the night, having nightmares, also having body aches, headaches, IBS, those kinds of things can happen. Negative cognitive distortions, again, that's how you view yourself, others in the world. And what's the most important is that social support is the most powerful protection against becoming overwhelmed in stress and trauma. So a study was conducted after the World Trade Centers on 9/11. So they actually found that there was a surprisingly low amount of PTSD from that incident. And a big thing of what they found was when individuals are in a state of panic, they're more likely to run home. And so those people that ran home to a caring relationship, safety, were less likely to develop PTSD, but those who ran home to abusive relationships, chaotic homes, were more likely to develop PTSD. You can go to that next slide. So trauma is really the chameleon of diagnoses. It can look like all sorts of different things. It can really look like almost anything in the DSM, so any kind of disorder, because some people will show more of that mood component. Some people will show anxiety. A big thing is substance use disorders. And you'll kind of see on the right side of my slide how that progresses, where sometimes people will have those symptoms that are very distressing, such as not being able to sleep, having these memories bother you, and they'll cope by using substances. But when we use substances, then you're not as aware of your surroundings. You might get into dangerous situations, which can sometimes lead to more trauma, more distress. And to cope with that, they up the substance use, and it just becomes very cyclical, and people can become stuck in that. And complex trauma, as I was saying earlier, so that's that repeated variety of different traumas, often occurring at home and in relationships. A lot of times that looks very similar to borderline personality disorder. And that's just people's way of coping with things, keeping themselves safe. And it becomes very dysfunctional with having self-harming behaviors, that unstable self-image, paranoia about their surroundings. Okay, and we can go to the next one. So looking at calming traumatic responses in the moment. So a good thing to do is recognize those vulnerabilities that they have in that moment. And those vulnerabilities can be related to health. So are they sick right now? Did they get a lot of sleep? Have they been eating enough lately? And then oppressed groups often have those vulnerabilities automatically because of the microaggressions that they suffer. Looking at the environment in the moment. So creating a sense of safety and calm, having good eye contact, a soft tone, having as much predictability to the environment as you can. So having a schedule is really helpful, and keeping structure. So having your roles being known, having those good limitations and good boundaries. And then in the moment, if somebody is really struggling, you can check the facts. So a lot of times when people get overwhelmed, they might have cognitive distortions where they're catastrophizing things, you know, oh, I failed this test, so I'm never going to college, or something like that. You know, Timmy took my pencil and he really hates me. So really kind of trying to rein that in and bring it back to, are you sure that you're not going to go to college because of this one test? Are you sure he hates you? Maybe he just forgot. So really checking the facts with that. Using different coping skills like regulating breathing is huge. And then kind of the next step after that is, with that regulated breathing, having the tensing and untensing of muscles that helps our body to calm down and to relax. And then even identifying kind of that point person of, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm going to go talk to this person. And go to the next slide. Okay, so in the next few slides, I'm going to try to put all of this together on how you are born with this brain, but with different traumas, it can impact how the brain works for you and how it can change. And so with this picture, in general, you kind of see that flip for people, whereas with typical development, you have a lot more space for creativity, having that emotional expression, emotional recognition, but that's the least important thing for those who are chronically traumatized, whereas they're mostly focused on safety and survival. You can go to the next slide. So there are many changes that happen with the brain as a result of developmental trauma. So specifically, brain scans show abnormal activation of the insula, and that really is how our brain interprets our muscles and joints. And so that can lead to those somatic complaints of having headaches. Sometimes it can even impact your balance, your ability to focus. And as said before, with fear being such a powerful emotion, the more traumatized you are, the more cognitively focused you are on making sure that you're safe, even if that's at an inappropriate time. And that consistent release of stress hormones, such as cortisol, is really going to eat away at your hippocampus. So those lesions that I was talking about earlier, the hippocampus, so that piece that involves memory, people are not able to properly process through traumas because their memory is damaged through that trauma response of the cortisol eaten away. So a hypersensitive amygdala and the frontal lobes can often be at odds with each other for kids. So when they're having trauma responses, especially at an inappropriate time, then the frontal lobes are going to be very judgmental and saying like, oh, you look so stupid. Why would you do that? So while the amygdala is trying to keep us alive, our frontal lobes can be very harsh and judgmental. And then I think a big thing to hammer away with this is that with therapy over time, it's not necessarily that you have less problems, but you have more comfort with it. And a lot of times what brings us a lot of distress isn't actually what's going on, but it's our reaction to our own feelings. And so therapy can really help with that. We can go to the next slide. So another way to simplify this is that living with chronic trauma can be like playing tennis with a 10-pound rock. So the rock in this example signifies that hypervigilance, negative feelings, and that effort towards avoiding things that make us feel uncomfortable. So people can still learn to play the game. They might even do okay at it, but they're going to get tired a lot more quickly and they're going to expend their resources a lot more often. And this can really just be very exhausting. So learning to put down the rock takes a lot of effort too. So you have to unlearn methods that were working for you in the beginning, learn new ones, and that can be really scary, but it can also maybe be surprising on looking at your newfound abilities. You can go to the next slide. So looking with this unlearning and relearning involves those neuro pathways, which can be kind of like pathways on a hike. So familiar pathway, that's the one that you're used to. It's basically your automatic go-to. So in the picture, it looks much more appealing, but this can be like a reaction for someone being aggressive towards others. So maybe in the past, being aggressive was helpful. And now that you're growing up, it isn't helpful anymore. So if you're aggressive towards others, maybe that kept you safe when you were young, but now it's keeping you from making new friends, getting a job, living that healthy life. So it's really hard to switch how you react to things. And that's why kind of like this top photo, you have to learn new skills to use, and you have to use them repeatedly over and over and over for it to become that more clear pathway. And another thing that can be really difficult with this is a lot of times it gets worse before it gets better. And that's why you have to be really persistent. And with these kids, you have to kind of like you were saying with going to class, like they really need that reinforcement because this is so hard. Go to the next slide, please. And so with treatment, there are different techniques. So there's extinction, which is that unlearning component where you are addressing that thing that is safe, but is still making you feel very uncomfortable. So that is that unlearning component and being introduced to that in a safe environment. Habituation is doing that over and over, so repeatedly confronting the feared stimuli in a gradual way. Flooding is something that's not done in the United States quite as much. It's more of a European thing, but so if somebody's afraid of spiders, a way of flooding them would be having pictures of spiders all over the wall, having a real spider in their hand, that kind of like overwhelming one-time thing. In the United States, we more do that gradual buildup so that they feel more confident, building mastery with that. Self-care activities are very, very valuable to self-control and self-soothing. It's important to avoid allowing kids to use humor when they're talking about trauma, because that ultimately is just a form of avoidance. And again, checking the facts so that we can understand and cope with different triggers. You can go to the next slide. So as we said before, the two sides of the brain speak different languages, verbal and nonverbal. So memory of a traumatic event is very different from a happy event by the organization and physical reactions. So our happy memories, you can recall a past, a present, or a before, a during, and an after with a happy event. Whereas with traumatic memories, it's very disorganized. There's often gaps in the memory with inconsistent details. And in states of high sympathetic nervous system arousal, that linguistic encoding of memory is inactivated. And this, one of these next slides is going to really show that. So when we're really overwhelmed, the right side, the emotional side, is what's kind of driving. So we often remember traumatic events through our emotions and through our feelings rather than as a narrative. And so a lot of times when you do trauma therapy, you try to put words to it so that you have more control over the context. Move to the next slide. Okay, so I think that this is really interesting, in that some people report flashbacks are worse than the actual event because there truly is no beginning or end. So they can be unpredictable in real life or from nightmares, and that can be to the point where people feel like they try to schedule their lives around intrusive thoughts and memories. So some people might exercise compulsively, never being strong enough to feel safe. Some might numb themselves with drugs and alcohol. And some might try to cultivate an illusory sense of control in highly dangerous situations, such as speeding in a car, thrill seeking. And so constantly fighting these unforeseen dangers becomes exhausting, leaving the individual feel very fatigued and depressed. So those who discuss their trauma react differently. Some may have a spike in blood pressure and have a migraine, and others might shut down emotionally. But there's usually that consistent heart rate increase with those stress hormones churning. And so you can kind of click through some of these details with this slide. So on the left, you'll see two brains. And so this was actually the brains of a husband and a wife that were in a very bad car accident. And so the husband's brain is on top, and that shows that in this fMRI, where they're asked to relive the trauma by just kind of talking about it, giving those details, his brain is reacting as if he's in the car at that moment and it's happening right now. So all of these brain regions are firing. He's trying to have that fight or flight response, even though it's not happening. So similarly, the wife is asked to do the same thing, where she's telling the story of the car accident, but her brain looks like it's almost offline. And so that's that freeze response. The brain is turning off. And so in the context of this, you learn that the wife had trauma early in life and learned to deal with the trauma in this way. So these are two very distinct differences in how people can react, whereas the husband had the fight or flight, the wife had the freeze response, and that's how the brain differs and how that looks. You can go to the next slide. So looking at examples with the youth you work with, ultimately, brains impacted by trauma show important changes So it's going to really impact their ability to concentrate. They might be more fidgety. That can even look like ADHD when it's not. They're going to have heightened reactions to blame, and they might trust too much or too little. And so what's important is to try to maintain structure and limits and have the most predictable environment that you can. Whenever kids are having those challenging behaviors, it's important to try to ignore what you can, label praise for what is good, and that can be labeling their praise. For example, let's say if you ask a kid to sit at the front of the classroom and they grumble and they gripe, but ultimately they come and sit at the front of the classroom, ignore that they grumbled and griped. They still did what you asked, right? And so having that positive interactions is going to foster for more positive interactions moving forward. So try to give concrete directions at first. For some people, you don't know if kids can handle those 3 to 4 step prompts. And then maintaining composure whenever they are escalating, because if you change your tone of voice, kind of like we said earlier, that reaction is going to heighten. Modeling how to react in difficult situations. So having calm breaths is really big. Kids have those mirror neurons where they're going to react how you react, or at least try to. Validate the kernel of truth in things. So like we said before, even if they're catastrophizing, saying, Tommy stole my pencil, he hates me, blah, 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 blah. You can say, he did take your pencil, and that can be really distressing. You know, so we don't have to say, you're right, he does hate you, but having validation for what is correct feels like you're in more control, and that can be very calming. So using those skills that soothe the nervous system, grounding skills, looking at our senses. So having people identify, you know, what they see in the room, what they hear, what they smell, that can be very grounding for individuals. And then checking the facts, breathing, like I said before. And we can go to the next slide. So does experience shape the brain, or does brain structure and function shape behavior? We asked that in the beginning. So hopefully this shows how the environment impacts the structure and function of the brain, from region size to activation of hormones. So this affects our interpretation of the world, which can make people more likely to interpret situations as dangerous. So the answer was yes. Like, we're born with our temperament, we're born with our abilities, and then our environment really shapes how those manifest. With the vast statistics involved in children who experience trauma, it's important to remember this information and look for the function of the behavior. So why are they acting this way? Stop yourself from making judgments and approach the situation with empathy. And though we can't control if kids are exposed to trauma, what we can do is we can have those safe environments where they feel more grounded and more in control through that consistency, predictability. And I think that ultimately having this as a safe space for them and having those positive interactions with adults is what's going to make a big difference. And that's really all I have, but I'd really love to hear if anybody's perceptions changed, if there's anything that you learned, or if there's any questions anybody has.
Feel free to come off mute or pop it in the chat. We've got a few more minutes here, guys.
I have a question for you, if that's okay. I'm Heidi. I'm the executive secretary for YIC team, but so I don't teach anything, but I have a family situation that is my friend, and her kids have been mentally, emotionally abused by their dad. And what would, like, she's looking to put them in counseling or whatever. Would it be better for them to be in counseling, or would it be better for them to be seeing a psychiatrist because of the environment they came from? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think I know what you're saying. And without a lot of the details, I think in general, it's safe to say that with a lot of difficulties with mental illness and those kinds of things, the best thing is having a medication and therapy. So with medications, the way that I think about medication is it's kind of like a life raft. So you hold on to the life raft to keep you afloat while you learn to swim in therapy. Once you learn to swim, you don't need the life raft anymore.
Okay.
But with kids, I mean, yeah, not knowing the situation, it's hard to say, but a lot of times the medication can kind of turn down the dial on the emotion so that they feel that they're not being attacked. They feel more present and being able to learn those skills, not as reactive.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
I really like that analogy. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, because sometimes I struggle with the medication part of it. So it's nice to have the analogy.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
I think I just have a question. And so a few of us in our program have been working with some kiddos in a family, and the kiddos, despite having lots of therapy and support to work through their stuff, are still acting out at school and running and even perpetrating on each other. And they've got a great foster family. So how long does it take for kiddos to try to start to respond to supports and help? And yeah, and how could we better support the foster parents and the school?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The way that I approach that is that these behaviors took a long time to develop. They certainly didn't become maladaptive overnight. This was something that they learned growing up. So it's hard to say a time frame, but I think that looking at the specific behaviors that you're trying to change, asking yourself, what's the function of this behavior? You know, nobody wants to keep getting in trouble and having people be disappointed in them and those kinds of things. So what is it they're getting out of this? Whatever you're seeing that's supporting that behavior, trying to look at changing that.
I agree. Going back to that why, I think sometimes is the challenge, but what we need to dig down to, because there's always a why to the what.
Can another quick question, can responses to trauma look like neurotypical kiddos? Like, can they look like kids with autism? Or I know you mentioned ADHD, but do you see that often where kiddos who have had trauma are diagnosed incorrectly?
Absolutely. Yes, that does happen. A lot of times that social aversion leads to people thinking, oh, maybe this is autism, because they're not interacting, they're not talking. And sometimes you'll even see that with, like, in extreme cases, like a conversion disorder, where kids are having those bodily reactions where they're blind or something very severe. But trauma can impact so many different things. And you're right, sometimes it looks like autism. It can really look like just about anything. Some people can have psychotic symptoms. Some people disengage completely. Some people are aggressive. So having that information on trauma is very important, and looking at the function and looking at how it's presenting.
And I just want to ask another question too, because I find this fascinating. But and I'm sorry if this is gross for everybody, but why do some of our kiddos who have trauma like use their fecal matter to like put on the walls and they soil themselves? I know it has to do with abuse, but why do they spread it around? Could you talk about that? I'm just curious why that would be. And I'm sorry, everybody, for being gross.
No, that's not gross. It's absolutely a sign of trauma. We would see it in the psych hospitals, not all the time, but enough to where it's something you need to know about. So you also see this in prisoners, adult prisoners, where they will also throw or spread fecal matter. And that's more of that protective idea of people think this is gross, so they're going to stay away from me.
I would, I mean.
It was like that works. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Well, I hate to cut us short, but we are 5 minutes past time and I'm watching people are dropping off because they've got to go to other meetings. So I want to go ahead and wrap up and thank Dr. Semenick for taking time to present to us. I'm so glad you were able to jump on early because obviously we wanted the time with you. Leah had to go to another meeting, but thank you again, Leah, for making sure you helped with this presentation today. And just as a reminder to everybody, this was our last webinar for the school year, but I will be announcing the webinar schedule for the new school year, hopefully soon, probably in another week or two, just working on finalizing the schedule. So I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. I hope you learned lots of new information. I know I'm going to need to watch the recording and digest it at least one more time before I'm going to feel like I learned everything that was presented for us today. So thank you all for taking time out of your day to join, and I look forward to seeing you all in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you.